Okay, let's dive in. Today, we're cracking open something really fascinating, the craft of creative writing.
Yeah, we've got these sources you shared, and the idea is to really dig into the core concepts they lay out.
Exactly. Everything from, where does an idea even start, through that whole messy middle part of drafting.
All the way to hopefully a finished piece, something polished that, actually connects with the reader.
That's the goal. So think of this as a kind of guided tour through the writer's workshop, right?
Mhm.
Using the insights from these texts.
Precisely. We'll look at where those sometimes elusive ideas pop up from.
How everyday experiences, situations become the building blocks.
Yeah, and the techniques, the nuts and bolts of shaping language.
And editing, which the sources suggest is surprisingly vital.
Oh, absolutely. And then things like structure, imagery, how you actually end the thing, how it all comes together.
So whether you're maybe tinkering with your own writing or you're just curious about how that magic happens on the page.
Let's explore what these particular sources have to say about putting words together creatively.
Okay, let's start right at the beginning then, the blank page moment. Where does it all come from? These sources talk about the genesis of the creative impulse. What even is that?
Well, they describe it as something quite specific. It's distinct from just, say, a fleeting emotion you have one day.
Okay, not just feeling blue and writing a sad poem.
Not usually, no. It's
Right.
often recurrent, something that keeps coming back. It involves empathy, a connection, and interestingly, it seems to need a bit of distance.
Distance from the event itself.
Yeah, either distance in time, like looking back, or maybe gaining a more impersonal perspective on it. That seems to help shape the impulse.
Huh, so it needs to settle a bit first.
Exactly. And it gets sort of concretized, made real through sharpened experience, observation,
Mhm.
and, of course, imagination.
And where do these impulses actually originate? Facts? Feelings?
It can be both. The sources say they can spring from factual events, things that really happen, but also, fascinatingly, from these submerged subconscious memories.
Stuff you might not even consciously remember.
Potentially, yes.
Mm.
Stuff that surfaces maybe unexpectedly.
That's intriguing. So the well of ideas might be much deeper, less obvious than we think. And the texts mention this phrase, the impulse is wedded to motivation, not vice versa. That caught my eye.
Ah, yes. That's a really key point, especially when we think about choosing themes.
So what does it mean for, picking what you write about?
Well, the sources suggest themes rarely come from a deliberate, conscious decision, like, okay, today I'm going to write about social justice.
Which is kind of how you might assume it works, right?
Right. Instead, they say themes often just occur to you. They seem to emerge organically from that initial creative impulse.
So you don't pick the theme first. The impulse brings its own theme along with it.
Often, yes. The impulse itself contains the seed of the theme. You follow the impulse, and the theme reveals itself.
That feels almost backward, but it makes a certain kind of sense.
But here's the thing, and this is crucial. Not every single one of these impulses actually pans out, right?
Oh, yeah, the graveyard of unfinished drafts. I know it well.
Exactly. Many just wither away. Or you start with great enthusiasm, and the idea it doesn't have the legs. It fizzles out.
So how do you know which ones are worth pursuing? Do the sources give any hints?
They stress the importance of, first, honoring those impulses.
Mm-hmm.
Pay attention when they arrive. But also, you need to test their viability.
You test them how?
Just probe them a bit. Do you feel like there's enough there? Does it spark more ideas? Does it feel like it could actually grow into something? Don't, commit your life to it until you've sensed it has potential.
Makes sense. And let's circle back to that wedded to motivation idea. The sources make a really clear distinction between the creative impulse and what they call abiding motivation.
Yes, this is vital. Think about a strong personal conviction, maybe a passion for environmentalism or social justice, like you said. That deep-seated motivation, that passion, isn't actually the same thing as the creative impulse itself.
So wanting to write about topic X isn't the impulse.
Not necessarily. And according to these texts, in really effective, powerful writing, that abiding motivation doesn't dominate the creative impulse. It actually subserves it.
Subserves it. That sounds passive, like it takes a back seat.
Kind of. It means it serves the impulse rather than being the main driver. The impulse comes first, the specific story or image.
How does that actually work? Can you give an example?
Sure. The sources use Bhagavati Panagrahi's story, Shikar. Now, the theme of social injustice towards poor tribals is undeniably strong, right?
Okay, yeah.
But the impulse to write that specific story, these texts suggest, probably didn't come just from the general abstract fact of injustice.
Where did it come from then?
More likely, it came from observing or imagining a specific person, like the character Ginua in the story, with his, quote, bizarre simplicity, that specific, compelling human element.
Ah, so the particular sparked the story, not the general issue.
Exactly. The intensity of that human narrative, Ginua's specific situation and personality, is what actually gives the broader motivation, the concern about injustice, its power and platform. It's not just a lecture about a problem.
Okay, I think I'm getting it. The impulse is the concrete thing, the person, the image, the scene that grabs you and demands to be explored. And your underlying value or motivations then feed into how you explore it, giving it depth.
You've got it. The human experience is the spark, the specific thing you see or feel.
Yeah.
The motivation provides maybe the undercurrent, the resonance, but the story leads.
Okay, so you've got this spark, this impulse, maybe a theme is starting to sort of bubble up. How do you actually start building a world from that? The sources talk a lot about situation and
The
experience.
situation is absolutely fundamental. One text compares it to flour for bread. You simply can't dramatize an idea or bring it to life without a situation for it to happen in.
And what counts as a situation? Anything.
Pretty much any aspect of human experience. Happy stuff, unhappy stuff, things specific to age or social context or occasions. You name it, it can be a situation.
Does it have to be something you've personally lived through? Or can you use stories you've heard?
The sources lean heavily towards direct involvement being crucial. They argue that secondhand accounts usually feel flat in creative writing because you lack that essential felt experience.
You haven't been there.
Exactly. You haven't seen it, smelled it, felt it in your gut. Now, they do mention an interesting exception.
Oh.
You can sometimes draw situations from great classics, from literature itself, but even then, the writer has to really put themselves into it, make that borrowed situation feel real through their own imaginative experience.
But for most writers, especially starting out, stick to what you know firsthand.
That seems to be the advice, yeah. Start with what you've directly experienced or observed closely.
Okay. And what about that mix the sources mention? Experience, observation, and imagination.
Ah, the magic trio. These are the core ingredients. Definitely. But the sources are quite funny about it. They say these are hardly ever matched in ideal proportions in any writer's head.
Meaning you usually have too much of one, not enough of another?
Pretty much, yeah.
Ah.
You might have tons of imagination but little direct experience of your subject or great observation skills, but you struggle to imagine beyond the literal. That's why they talk about the need for homework.
Homework. For creative writing. Sounds uncreative.
Ah, maybe. But they mean it more like being a researcher. You need to actively go out and deepen your experience related to your subject.
Like method acting, but for writers.
Sort of.
Mm-hmm.
And sharpen your observation skills. Really notice the tiny telling details. And rein in the imagination sometimes. Make sure it's grounded in some reality rather than just flying off entirely. Don't just invent wildly. Investigate.
Okay, so if you were writing about, say, a blacksmith, you shouldn't just guess. You should go watch one, talk to one.
Precisely. They give this great example of observing a bandamala, a monkey man performer. Just noting his surface details, the toothless grin, the slightly pathetic nature of his trade that might be enough for a quick article, maybe a feature piece.
Right, description.
But to turn that into a compelling short story, you need more. You need further observation, maybe talking to him, and then using your imagination to weave a tale around him.
Going deeper.
Yeah, connecting that surface appearance, the grin, the job, to the deeper possibilities of his inner life. Maybe he had this incredibly vibrant youth. Maybe he has this fierce independence hidden away. Or maybe he's just really cranky with his family. You have to dig and imagine that life beneath the surface.
That's a fantastic illustration. Moving from just seeing to actually understanding potential narrative. But here's a problem the sources bring up. Sometimes a situation feels incredibly powerful in your head.
And then you write it down and it just falls flat.
Exactly. It feels stale or commonplace, as they put it. Why does that happen? That gap between the felt experience and the written experience.
Well, according to the text, there are two main likely reasons. One, maybe the situation itself just isn't as unique or compelling as you thought it was. It felt big to you, but it's actually quite common.
Ouch.
Or two, and this is probably more common, especially for writers still developing their skills, you simply lack the necessary language craft to render it authentically on the page.
So the feeling is there, but the words aren't working.
Right. The intensity you felt inside isn't translating. You haven't found the words, the rhythm, the details to make an impersonal reader feel something similar. That skill, Using words to make a situation intelligible and authentic for someone else is absolutely paramount.
So it's not enough to just feel it deeply. You need the craft to actually convey that feeling using language.
Couldn't have put it better myself.
Which takes us perfectly into the next bit, the mechanics, the actual craft of writing itself.
Yeah, the fundamentals. At its most basic, the sources define writing as, quote, a system of human intercommunication by means of visible conventional markings.
Sounds very technical, but it makes sense.
It does. Think historically, writing emerged because gestures and speech have limits, right? You can't easily talk to someone far away or someone in the future.
Through cave drawings, then symbols, then alphabets.
Exactly. It was a huge leap, allowing communication across space and time.
Yeah.
It's how we know history, how we understand people different from ourselves. It's fundamental to human progress, really.
Absolutely. But why do individuals do it? Why sit down and write creatively? It's not always practical.
No, it's often not. The sources suggest it's primarily about expressing oneself, sharing experiences, joys, sorrows, trying to overcome that sense of loneliness, maybe, fulfilling a kind of social urge to connect.
So a deep psychological need.
And aesthetic, too. There's often a drive to make something, shape something with words. It's not just about money or fame, though those might follow. It starts with that internal need.
That feels right. So when you actually sit down to create that something, what are the core components of a literary work, according to these sources?
They break it down pretty neatly into four main aspects. First, there's the content. That's your raw material, your experience, your observations.
Okay.
Second, the form. There's a poem, a short story, a novel, a play, the genre you choose.
Got it.
Third, structure. This is about how you organize that content within the form, how you order it so the reader can follow along easily, and it makes sense.
The architecture of the piece.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And fourth, style. This is your unique way of expressing things, how you manipulate language, your sentence rhythms, word choices, your personal signature, really.
And they use some helpful analogies for this.
Yeah, they compare a good piece of writing to a well-built piece of architecture, where every single stone fits perfectly and contributes to the whole effect, or like a symphony.
The symphony, how so?
A harmonious orchestration of all the elements, words, sentences, paragraphs, images, all working together to create a unified impact. Nothing feels out of place.
And for that structure, that symphony to work, one quality seems absolutely essential: clarity.
Oh, absolutely paramount. The sources hammer this home. Clarity, lucidity, directness, whatever you call it. They see it as one of the most important values for readability.
Why so crucial?
Because if the writing isn't clear, it simply can't communicate. It becomes, as they bluntly put it, unmeaning. What's the point if the reader can't understand you?
Fair point. How do you achieve it then?
Several things are needed. Mastery of your subject, you have to know what you're talking about. Some distance helps, seeing it objectively. And crucially, defining your subject, clearly knowing what you want to say before you try to say it.
Get your own thoughts straight first.
Precisely. And they also note that sometimes, ironically, too much rigidity, like sticking strictly to academic rules, can actually get in the way of clarity in creative expression. You need some freedom, some spontaneity.
But clarity doesn't mean dumbing it down, right?
Not at all. It's not about avoiding complexity or just making simple statements. They explicitly mention Henry James as someone who deals with incredibly complex psychological and social situations with remarkable clarity. It's about precision, not simplification.
Okay. And what about directness? Is that the same as clarity?
It's closely related. Maybe think of it as clarity with punch. Directness is about force of assertion, getting straight to the point without beating around the bush.
Force of assertion sounds powerful.
It is. They quote George Bernard Shaw saying, "Force of assertion is the alpha and omega of style." And that famous line from Oliver Cromwell. In the name of God, go. Just blend direct impact.
No messing about there.
None. They also show how even really sparse dialogue, like in Hemingway, can gain immense power through its directness. The very syntax, the word order, amplifies the meaning. It's about efficiency and hitting the mark.
Okay, so you've got the impulse, you've found a situation, you're armed with these goals of clarity and directness. The writing begins, but maybe not immediately. The sources talk about gestation.
Yes, this is a really interesting point. They compare the act of writing to giving birth, suggesting it should happen when the idea is ripe. Don't necessarily rush to the page the second an impulse strikes.
Let it cook for a while.
Exactly. That period of gestation, of letting it sit with you, allows the idea to become more personal, more intimate. It deepens its authenticity within you before you try to express it.
So you're thinking about it, turning it over in your mind.
Right. Thinking through the different facets.
Yeah.
What's the core theme here? What are some possible plot points or key situations? Who are the characters? Maybe even imagining snippets of dialogue. Jotting things down during this phase can be really helpful.
Capturing those fleeting thoughts.
Definitely. And then, importantly, they suggest preparing an outline.
An outline, really, for creative work. Doesn't that kill the spontaneity?
It's a common concern, but the source is actually recommended, especially for beginners. Thinking about how will this piece start? How will it develop in the middle? How will it end? That classic Aristotelian structure, beginning, middle, end.
Having a map before you start the journey.
Sort of, yeah. And also visualization, trying to get a clear picture of the story or poem in your head before you begin writing. They do acknowledge that some very experienced writers might work differently, maybe starting vague and letting the unconscious lead.
But that's maybe not the best approach for everyone starting out.
Probably not advisable for beginners, no. Having some kind of plan seems helpful.
Okay, so planning, outlining, visualizing, then you get the first draft down. Phew. Job done.
If only. According to these sources, that's often when the real work begins. Then comes editing.
Right, editing. What does that actually involve?
Well, the word itself, they point out, comes from the Latin editus, which means to put forth, or to publish. So fundamentally, it's about selecting the good material you've generated and ordering its presentation effectively for a reader.
And the sources talk about different kinds of editing.
They do. They distinguish between copy editing and general editing.
Okay, what's copy editing?
Copy editing is quite mechanical, very detail-oriented. It usually happens after a manuscript has been accepted for publication. The copy editor scrutinizes the text line by line.
Looking for what?
Typos, spelling errors, punctuation mistakes, grammatical slips, inconsistencies. They also mark it up for the typesetter symbols for type style, layout instructions, making sure headings, titles, page numbers are all correct. It's like dressing the manuscript properly for its public appearance. Requires incredible focus.
Okay, the fine-tuning. What about general editing then?
General editing is a much bigger, more responsible role. This editor is assessing the whole manuscript, its fundamental suitability.
Suitability in what sense?
Is the theme strong and clear? Is the presentation effective? What's the overall literary quality? Is it relevant or topical? They're described as being like a good critic who not only finds faults, but also sets them right.
So they're making suggestions for improvement.
Big suggestions, potentially. It requires deep literary knowledge and broad taste. The process often involves a first quick read just to get a feel for it, see if it grabs them, because as they say, what does not interest the editor cannot interest his readers.
Makes sense. A gatekeeper function.
In a way. Then, if it passes that first hurdle, there's a second, much closer read, often with a famous blue pencil, making critical notes, suggesting changes, maybe even structural revision.
Wow, that sounds intensive. Like they're really helping to shape the work.
They can be, yes. But here's a crucial point the sources make about the writer's own role in all this.
What's that?
That an author absolutely must learn to be their own first, and perhaps most important, editor.
We have to edit ourselves.
Definitely. They argue that creativity isn't just that initial burst of inspiration. It fundamentally involves selection, arrangement, and revision. You have to develop the skill, the discipline, to step back from your own precious words.
That's the hard part.
It really is. To scrutinize your own work objectively. Put it away for a week, a month, then come back to it with fresh eyes. Try to spot the awkward phrases, the cliches, the parts that drag, the moments that felt amazing when you wrote them but just don't land on the page.
So the first draft is just the clay. The sculpting happens in the editing.
That's a perfect analogy. Yeah, it's where the potential gets shaped into something coherent and effective.
Okay, let's shift focus slightly to shaping the narrative arc itself, the structure of the story or poem. The sources spend time on beginnings, climaxes, and endings. Why is the beginning so important?
Well, from a purely practical view, especially if you want to get published, it's absolutely critical. Editors are busy, often swamped with submissions.
So they judge quickly.
Very quickly. The sources state, quite frankly, that the first few paragraphs, sometimes even just the first sentence or two, can determine whether they keep reading or toss it aside.
Wow, no pressure then.
Right. It has to grab them immediately. It needs to be interesting, engaging, preferably dramatic in some way. Like a curtain raiser for a play, it needs to pull you in right away, plunge you into the world without a lot of throat clearing.
Any examples mentioned?
Yeah, they point to openings by writers like Mok Rajanand or Keki Darawala as examples of how to hook a reader effectively from the get-go.
Okay, so hook them at the beginning. You develop the situation, the characters, and you build towards that peak moment, the climax. How do the sources define that?
The climax is described as that point of maximum intensity, the crucial turning point in the story that precipitates some kind of crisis or resolution. It's where the conflicts converge.
Is it always the most action-packed scene, like the
Uh,
big fight?
Not necessarily, no.
Okay.
The sources make a useful distinction here. Sometimes you have an uncomplicated climax, easy to spot, often in plot-driven stories involving a key event or action.
Okay.
But other times, the climax can be much more complicated, more subtle, maybe harder to pinpoint exactly.
Like an internal realization.
Precisely. They analyze a story by Malcolm Scott as an example. In that story, the character faces a potential physical threat, but that's not actually the climax.
What is it then?
The climax is a quieter but much more profound moment. The revelation of the antagonist's deep-seated contempt and racial prejudice. It's an emotional and psychological peak, not an action peak.
And the resolution follows from that revelation.
Exactly. The protagonist doesn't respond with violence, but the outrage shifts from a personal insult to a defense of a principle, the principle of not insulting women. This leads to a kind of internal transformation, a radical conversion for the character.
That's a really powerful idea, the climax as a moment of understanding or change, not just action. What about endings then? Are they just about tying up loose ends?
The sources suggest they're much more than that. Good endings aren't just closures, they function as revelations. They shed light on the people, the situations, the meaning of the whole story. They can even be open, suggesting future possibilities rather than shutting everything down.
So the ending gives meaning to what came before.
Yes, it makes the structure of the story, and maybe metaphorically, the structure of life within the story, feel whole. It lends meaning and purpose. They cleverly adapt T.S. Eliot, suggesting, "In my ending is my beginning," meaning the ending you choose shapes how the reader ultimately understands the entire form and direction of the work.
Interesting. Are there different types of endings?
Definitely. The texts outline a few common kinds. There's the single effect ending, which often relies on a surprise twist or reversal. Think O. Henry, or the startling resolutions in many detective or crime stories.
The big reveal.
Exactly. Then there are endings primarily focused on establishing or confirming a specific mood and atmosphere. This is common in horror or tales of alienation.
Like Poe.
Precisely. They mention Poe's The Black Cat or W. Jacobs's The Monkey's Paw. The ending serves to fulfill a prophecy, confirm a pervasive sense of dread, or lock in the story's overall unsettling mood.
Okay. What else?
They also discuss formula stories. These often project the reader's own desires or fantasies. They tend to deliver predictable outcomes, often involving poetic justice.
Like genre fiction.
Often, yes. Think traditional romances, many detective series, some sci-fi, soap operas. The ending follows a known pattern designed to satisfy the audience's expectations within that specific formula. You kind of know the hero will win or the couple will get together.
So the ending isn't just stopping. It's the final chord that makes the whole piece resonate, whether it's with surprise, mood, or fulfilling a formula.
Well put. It's the crucial final step in shaping the reader's experience.
Now, how do you ensure that all of this, the structure, the characters, the situations, actually feels real to the reader? The sources talk about authenticity and credibility.
Yes, these are absolutely fundamental if you want your writing to be valued, to feel true. Authenticity, the texts argue, needs to be rooted in the truth of facts.
Does that mean it has to be nonfiction?
Not necessarily true in the factual sense, but grounded. You can't just say invent the details of how a complex machine works or what it feels like to experience profound grief without basing it on careful observation, accurate memory for detail, or doing that research homework we talked about earlier.
It comes back to that idea of living the experience.
Exactly. They use that phrase again. The writer must somehow live the experience, either directly or through deep imaginative engagement and research. They also caution writers about crossing cultural or experiential barriers without handling it very skillfully and respectfully.
Who do they cite as doing this well?
Writers like Raja Rao and R.K. Narayan are mentioned as masters of achieving authenticity by deeply inhabiting the specific Indian locales and cultures they write about.
And they contrast this with how a child reads.
Yes, pointing out that a child will often readily accept the incredible just for the sake of a good story. They aren't necessarily demanding strict realism or worrying about moral implications, but the adult mind, generally, seeks that feeling of authenticity.
Okay, so authenticity is about being grounded in some kind of truth, whether factual or experiential. What about credibility, then? Is that the same thing?
It's very closely related, but credibility seems to emerge from authenticity. It's maybe less about the factual accuracy and more about whether the writing feels believable, whether the reader buys into it. It's a matter of a degree.
Can something be factually true but not credible in writing?
Absolutely. The sources point out that a real event, described poorly or without capturing the felt reality, can actually seem unbelievable or emotionally false on the page. Think about reading a dry, bureaucratic report about some tragedy versus a powerful literary account of the same event. The difference lies in the author's ability to imbue the facts with authenticity, making them credible and moving for the reader.
The examples they use really clarify this. Mulkraj Anand's The Lost Child.
Yes, that story is highlighted as feeling authentic because it's clearly rooted in Anand's own vivid memory of being lost as a child, even though he's writing about any child.
How does he build that authenticity?
Through incredibly rich, specific sensory details of the setting, the season, the mustard fields, the crowds at the fair, and by totally immersing us in the child's perspective, his absorption in the sights and sounds, the dragonflies, the banyan tree, the sweets, the snake charmer. The poetic language makes the child's inner world feel utterly authentic.
And Raja Rao's The Cow of the Barricades. That sounds more symbolic.
It is, but the authenticity comes first from the factual grounding, the specific details of the village, the political atmosphere, characters like the master and his disciples, the red men. That feels real.
So where does the credibility come in, especially with the symbolic cow?
Credibility is achieved when the cow, Gowrie, is invested with this conscious purpose, acting almost like a willing martyr for the cause. This becomes believable, the sources argue, because Rao taps into the myths suggested by the cow's name and the ethos which invests it with the aura of divinity in that cultural context. He blends the factual base with a deeper cultural truth.
Making the symbolic feel earned, believable within that world.
Exactly. And R.K. Narayan's A Horse and Two Goats shows yet another angle, using authenticity as a base for comedy.
How does that work?
Well, Narayan starts with a completely authentic, vividly described foundation. The tiny village of Kritam, the impoverished old man Muni, his wife, the local shopkeeper, that specific crumbling terracotta horse statue by the roadside. All totally believable.
Okay, the setting is real.
Then, onto that real base, he layers comic exaggeration. The hilarious conversation between Muni, who only speaks Tamil, and the American tourist, who only knows yes and no, works because they talk completely at cross purposes against this very real, grounded backdrop.
The misunderstanding feels believable because the characters in place feel real.
Precisely. The authenticity of the base allows the linguistic confusion to escalate into what these sources call comic unreality. It's funny because it's happening in a place that feels true.
So authenticity provides the solid ground, and credibility is the quality that makes the reader willingly suspend disbelief and invest emotionally in the story, whether it's realistic, symbolic, or even comic.
That captures it really well, I think.
Now, to add even more richness and depth to all this, the sources talk about tools like imagery and symbols. How do they help?
They're incredibly powerful tools for dramatizing ideas, for sure, but also for heightening our perceptions, deepening them, offering fresh ways of seeing the world within the story.
And imagery isn't just visual, right?
Correct. It appeals to all the senses. Sight, yes, but also smell, taste, touch, hearing. Good imagery makes the writing more vivid, more concrete.
What's their function beyond just making things vivid? What do they do for the reader?
According to these texts, they help us see into the heart of things. They can create a feeling of connection and affinity with characters, creatures, even the landscape. The sources beautifully call this a kind of love.
Seeing connections we might otherwise miss.
Yes, and seeing underlying patterns or designs, maybe feeling that all parts of the same body universe. So their function is threefold: providing freshness, revealing something new; intensity, concentrating meaning; and evocative power, triggering emotions or associations.
And metaphor is key here.
Absolutely central. There's a great quote mentioned: "Try to be precise, and you are bound to be metaphorical." When you really try to nail down a feeling or observation, you often reach for comparisons.
They give examples, especially from poetry.
Yes, poetry often relies heavily on imagery and symbolism. It's seen as the language of heightened awareness, strong feelings, intuition. They mention poets like Shiv K. Kumar or Lankesh using powerful earth, animal, or bodily images. Or the classic bread and wine symbols packing huge meaning.
Is it just poetry or fiction too?
Oh, fiction uses figurative language extensively too. It's not just decoration. It's woven into the fabric of the narrative, often reflecting social or historical contexts, revealing character, deepening themes.
Okay. Now, building on this idea of grounding things, the sources briefly mention something very practical: acknowledging sources. Seems a bit academic for creative writing.
It might seem so, but if your creative work relies heavily on specific factual research, historical details, scientific concepts, biographical information, these texts suggest it's important to acknowledge where that information came from.
So if you're basing a novel on real events.
Exactly. Or even if you've just done a lot of background reading that significantly informs the world you've built. It could be done unobtrusively, maybe with footnotes or endnotes. It's part of that research homework and showing respect for the factual basis you might be using.
Got it. A practical consideration for maintaining that authenticity we talked about. Okay, finally, let's talk about something that feels like it pulls everything together. The authorial voice. What exactly is that?
The authorial voice is that distinct sense of a personality or perspective behind the words. It's the utterance, as the sources call it, that speaks to you, the reader. You can often almost visualize it. Is the voice compassionate, cynical, detached, witty, urgent?
And this voice adds realism.
Yes, a strong, consistent, and convincing voice is what lends successful writing that feeling of verisimilitude, that essential lifelikeness. It makes you believe someone is really telling you this story.
How does a writer create or choose this voice? Do they always just write as themselves?
Oh, definitely not. The sources outline several different modes of address, different ways the voice can manifest.
Like what?
Well, there's the direct or autobiographical mode. Here, the author seems to be speaking quite openly in their own persona. The Kamala Das sketch mentioned is an example.
What are the pitfalls there?
The big risk is sentimentality, if it's not carefully controlled, or sounding self-indulgent. A discerning reader can often sense when an autobiographical voice feels forced or false.
Okay. What else?
There's diary writing as a mode. This often feels more fragmented, maybe jumbled, or even like a stutter, as one source puts it. But it can be incredibly powerful when unified by a strong, dominant emotion. It conveys intense self-involvement.
More intimate, perhaps.
Potentially, yes.
Then there's using an imaginary character as the narrator or viewpoint.
Like Huck Finn or Holden Caulfield.
Exactly. The author speaks through a created persona. This offers the writer a degree of privacy, maybe, but also allows for great intimacy with the reader through that character's specific voice and perspective.
And the classic narrator. Right, the partial or all-knowing omniscient mode. Here, the authorial voice stands somewhat outside the story, able to comment on characters and events, provide background information, maybe even address the reader directly about the story's progress or meaning. Think of many 19th century novels.
So the voice is essentially the perspective, the lens through which the story is told, whether it's the author's own, seemingly, or filtered through a character or a more detached narrator.
That's a great way to summarize it. And ultimately, learning to really listen for that distinctive voice in any piece of writing is key. It helps you understand the driving force, the impulsion behind his writing, as the sources say, what made the author tell this story in this way.
Wow. Okay, so to try and wrap up this deep dive, we've really covered a lot of ground. We started with that initial creative spark, that impulse.
Often mysterious, needing distance.
Right. Then how situations and lived experience become the raw material, the building blocks.
Mixed with observation and imagination and needing that homework.
Then we got into the essential craft, the need for clarity, directness, solid structure, and that crucial, often overlooked stage of editing and revision.
Being your own toughest critic, essentially.
Absolutely. Then shaping the actual narrative. Powerful beginnings to hook the reader, climaxes that provide turning points, not always action, and endings that resonate and give meaning.
Endings as revelations, not just stops.
And grounding it all in authenticity, that connection to lived truth or deep research to achieve credibility, making the reader believe and feel.
Even when it's symbolic or comic, like in Rao or the Ryan.
And finally, adding those layers of depth and richness through vivid imagery, potent symbols, and developing that unique, compelling, authorial voice.
It really is an intricate journey, isn't it? From that first flicker of an idea to something that hopefully lands with the reader.
It truly is. These sources make it so clear that it's not just about raw talent or waiting for inspiration. It's this incredible blend of, yes, that innate spark, but also disciplined craft, thoughtful structure, and a real commitment to translating something felt internally onto the page in a way that connects with someone else.
Making the experience real and meaningful for the reader is key.
So thinking about this whole journey we've traced, from the impulse to the polished prose, based on everything we've discussed from these sources today, what single element for you maybe stands out the most? Is there one part of this process that feels particularly crucial or maybe even surprising?